reach back through the ages, prophets and sages, and our fathers and our mothers stalked the way. Dig down through the rubble, finding foundations on which our fathers and our mothers built a world. Explore ancient pathways, crossing continents and our oceans to the home of liberty. Rise up and rebuild now on the foundations. Clear the path so others can find their way home.
So, hello, folks, and welcome to Taproot. This is episode 10 officially, and we thank you so much for tuning in. Without you guys, we wouldn't be doing Taproot. So, the fact that you listen or watch and share with your friends, family, whoever, we greatly appreciate that, and we don't want you to think for a minute that we take that for granted. So I just wanted to start off with that. Today with me is Mr. Marshall Wilson, as usual. And Marshall has been traveling a bit here recently. And so I did a fill-in episode, but I'm going to let him tell you about his adventures here to start off with. But first, I would like to say a few things about the word virtue. It's a trait of excellence that may be moral or intellectual. The cultivation and refinement of virtue is held to be the good of humanity, and thus is valued as an end purpose of life or foundational principle of being. In human practical ethics, a virtue is a disposition to choose words and actions that are successful by showing high moral standards, doing what is right and avoiding what is wrong in a given field or endeavor. By taking pleasure in doing what is right, even when it is difficult or initially unpleasant, virtue becomes habitual. And such a person could be said to be virtuous through having cultivated this disposition. And then I was telling Marshall the etymology of the word. Actually, the ancient Romans used the Latin word virtus, derived from vir, which was their word for man, to refer to all of the excellent qualities of men, including physical strength, valorous conduct, and moral rectitude. So that's kind of good to start us off. And Marshall, if you would like to tell us a little bit about your adventures, and then we'll talk more about virtue.
Hey, Todd, it's good to be back, and I appreciate you picking up the slack while I was gone. Actually, I don't suppose there's much slack to pick up. You do all the smart stuff on this program. So, as you know, and some of our other friends know, I used to live in Peruvian Amazon. I was a missionary. I was a church planter. I also taught systematic theology and leadership and accountability and that sort of thing in the Amazon jungle to local village pastors. While I was down there, I ended up starting the adoption process on a couple of kids, and they're our kids now, and we love them and we're crazy about them. And it took us 12 years to get them from Peru to the United States. 12 painful, horrifying. Maybe one day I'll actually write the story down because it will blow people's minds. But 12 years to bring them from Peru to the United States. And we told them when they finally came to live here that, of course, we would take them back fairly regularly to visit friends and family in Peru. And so we intended to do that, but during the COVID fiasco hiatus, as imposed by the various governments involved, we were not able to take them down to Peru until recently. And this became our opportunity this year to take them down there. We got their passports, and traveling out of the country on a U.S. passport and returning to the country on a U.S. passport was kind of a major milestone for us. And while we were down there, we saw some old friends, including one friend I bumped into completely, from our perspective, by accident. We used to live and work out of the same town. Now, this is a Peruvian gentleman. He was the pastor of the deaf church and the director of the deaf school in Iquitos, Peru, named Abran, and his wife Patsy and their kids, and had not seen them in years. I mean, probably close to 10 years. I haven't seen or really heard from them. Had no idea where they lived or what they were doing. And we were in Iquitos and they were not. And we traveled. We just wanted to take the kids and our friend Teodora and her son David, who cared for our kids while we were trying to get them to the United States. We just went to visit a nice town in the Andean foothills in the jungle, what they call the high jungle, called Taproot. Just a beautiful place. And we figured that Teo deserved a little trip to see more of her country than she ever had. And just trying to show a little bit of gratitude to her for all that she's done for our family. So we went to Tarapoto, and we are literally driving, we're riding around town in a local van. A local driver is driving us around town and showing us the sights. And we stopped at an intersection and looked out the window, and Abran and Patsy and their children were standing on the sidewalk right there.
Wow.
Amazing. So you know me, I immediately jumped out of the van into traffic to go say hi to Abran. Totally scared everybody, folks in the van, my family, they're all like, where's Dad going? Why did he jump out in front of that car? And ran up to Abram, and of course you can just imagine what that looked like to him. This crazy guy, running up and hollering at him on the sidewalk. But it was great. It's really amazing. It was a great trip. Not only that, but our friend Teo, who, as I said before, took care of our kids. She does a very important service to the ladies who are in rough situations in the town of Iquitos, and the local church, the pastor of whom is a friend of mine, and his wife, they support this as much as they can. But what we're trying to do, or what my wife Julie is trying to do, is to raise support on the U.S. side that we can then empower them to be more effective. And Teo is doing great work with the little bit that she has, and we just want to make sure she has more. So we were out of the loop here. I told Todd when I planned on leaving that I would do my best to actually do episodes from Peru. And believe it or not, the internet connection that we had down there was even worse than what you find in the hinterlands of West Virginia. It was pretty bad. So streaming video was simply not an option. And I want to apologize to our regular listeners for that, or to all of our listeners, and especially to Todd, because I kind of left him holding the bag, but he managed. Probably you guys probably would rather hear Todd talk than me anyway. I know I would. But that's what was going on. I didn't mean to leave you hanging, and I certainly didn't mean to leave Todd and our production team hanging. But I had a couple of pretty important purposes to serve in Peru, and that's what we did. So the timing was kind of rough for us, but once everything lined up, Julie could get time off from work, and we actually had the kids' passports and all that sort of thing. I had to pull the trigger, and we had to go, because the kids, we had been waiting too long to go back.
Right.
And it was, so my apologies for that. I know that I kind of sprang that on you. Thank you for being gracious about it. I want to thank Justine too for putting up with that. But she's known me for a long time, so she understands that when the mission critical task is in the sights, I'm going to pull the trigger. So anyway, y'all, thank you for putting up with me. Let's move on and talk about virtue. And by the way, leaving your friends hanging is not considered virtue. But the grace that you've offered me is pretty virtuous. So thank you. So the definition that you read a while ago, if I may, I'd like to paraphrase and maybe distill it a little bit. And this is how I understand virtue. And you can correct me based on the definition you've got there if I miss something. So virtue, generally speaking, in postmodern American usage, when you say virtue, people instantly assume that you mean you're a virgin, that you're not engaging in sexual activity, or at least not promiscuous sexual activity. That is a very small perspective on that word. That word actually refers to value, worth, goodness, anything that, according to standards of what's right and what's good, actually stands on its own. So you mentioned physical strength and conditioning. There are virtues of physical strength and conditioning that cannot be denied, even if the person who has those virtues lacks other virtues. And it applies to basically all of the virtues, but what we're talking about here is the concept of virtue as a philosophical principle, not just the specific results of it. And am I still on track here, Todd?
Yes. Yeah. And I had noticed something, I think there are a lot of different ways to describe virtue. So prudence is a good word, from the Latin prudentia. And then also it says wisdom, Sophia, the ability to discern the appropriate course of action to be taken in a given situation at the appropriate time. And I thought that word caught my eye because I know you and I have talked about Sophia many times.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the Greek for wisdom. And of course, as you know, my novel,
Yep.
Sophistry, refers to false wisdom. Yeah, so that's a concept that's very important to me. But the philosophical principle of virtue is what underlies all of that. So wisdom is not virtue, it is a virtue, but virtue displaying itself through prudence, through good decision making, through common sense. All of those are different forms of or ways that virtue is expressed, right?
Right.
I think it's interesting that C.S. Lewis says that courage is not one of the virtues. It is the expression of virtue at its testing point. So I think that's kind of fascinating. But if we can, I'd like to talk specifically about the ramifications of the concept of virtue, not just the specific virtues, although those are the indicators that virtue is at work, and they are what actually practically creates good in our world, are the actual expressions of virtue. But virtue itself, ramifications of the concept of virtue in Western governance. Now, of course, I want to focus on Western governance because, as we've discussed previously, the U.S. after the abolition of slavery and then the amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which made the prior slaves, the people who were held in chattel bondage by other people, made them into actual voting members of our society. That is the pinnacle of Western society, in my estimation, Western civilization throughout time. That is the moment when we actually lived out the virtues of Western civilization and the pinnacle. Since then, we've been in decline, in my estimation. But so let's talk about the actual ramifications of the concept of virtue in Western governance. So from the very beginning of Western civilization, going all the way back to Aristotle, it's been determined that virtue's application to the forms of government is the foundation of the free and prosperous West. And going back to Aristotle, he said, whoever takes thought for good governance gives careful attention to virtue and vice. careful attention to virtue and vice. And once again, vice here would be the concept of vice, which can be expressed in myriad ways. Not just, we talk about vice at the police department, the vice squad or whatever. They're dealing with like gambling and prostitution, and all of those are vices, but the concept of vice is expressed through them. So virtue is, the concept of virtue is what is good and right and neat and fit, and vice is basically the corruption of all of that. And as we've discussed previously, the two principles, the two underlying principles to everything that was going on when they founded the United States of America, and the purpose for which they founded it. First of all men are created equal. That equality is expressed in the rights with which we are all endowed. We're all endowed with the exact same set of inalienable rights. So all men are created equal. And the second principle is all men are corrupt. You take those two concepts, and that frames everything for our discussions. So when I taught this to in a bachelor's level class for high school students, invariably one of the students would pop off and say, well, yeah, what about you? And my response is yes, I am also corrupt. I am a man. All men, once again, meaning the creature man, whether male, female, tall, short, whatever, all iterations, all variations on that creature, all of them are included in this. All men are created equal, and all men are corrupt, every single one of us. So the reason that our government was formed the way it was, and we'll discuss where that idea came from here in just a second, was to, first of all, allow the people to exercise their virtue by choosing virtuous, once again, honorable, worthwhile people to serve their interest, to which their interest is defined in the Declaration of Independence, to secure their natural rights, but also to hold them, to keep them virtuous. So James Madison, who was the father of the Constitution, he considered the aim of every political constitution. So the guy who wrote our Constitution, or who kind of brought it all together, said that the aim of every political constitution is to first obtain for rulers men who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of society. And again, that common good was defined as to secure the natural rights of each citizen. It's not whatever the bunch of us decide. There are principles that guide this. This is not just, the mob rule, or, the democracy as we've discussed in the past. It's actually a republic which follows a certain set of principles, that being to secure the natural rights of the purpose being of that republic is to secure the natural rights of each individual citizen. So the aim of every political constitution, according to the father of our Constitution, is to be first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue that common good by securing the natural rights of each citizen. And in the next place, and I love this part, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous whilst they continue to hold their public trust. It's not enough just to pick the right guy, vote for him, and then go home. Every 4 years or every 2 years, depending on what election cycle you're in, you're like, I'm going to pick the guy. That's my guy. You know what? Our loyalty is not to individual people. It's not to candidates. It's not to parties. It's not to tribes or people groups, or the people who are short, loud, ugly Irishmen like I am, or, tall, good looking and urbane people like Todd. It's not about that. It's about our overarching dedication to the principles that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And that our job as the owners of this government, and we are the owners, we the people form this government to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's from the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. The reason we did this, we have to, as James Madison said, take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous whilst they continue to hold their public trust. In other words, according to James Madison, the father of our Constitution, our job is to choose the right people to serve in our government, and then to hold them accountable, to keep them virtuous while they're in office. And because the people ultimately form the union, we formed the union, that enables us to ensure justice, or to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren on down the line. The fact is that we formed this union, and we continue to form this union, the United States of America, and the government that we created to serve the United States of America by securing the natural rights of each individual citizen. We own it. This is our job. And the way that we express our virtue in governance is by doing what James Madison said. We choose the right people, and then we hold them accountable to the standard. The way that we measure virtue in our governance is how close that government or those candidates or those elected or hired or appointed representatives who, not representatives, but employees who work in that government, how close they in their daily actions actually come to meeting that standard to secure the natural rights of each individual citizen. That is virtue in governance. That's it. That is the definition of virtue in governance. That everything you do, everything the government does, everything each functionary, each department, each branch of the government does is for the purpose and is effectual to the purpose of securing the natural rights of each citizen. And vice is measured in governance by the distance between that standard and the actions that the government is taking. So any action the government which takes, or any functionary of the government at whatever level takes, that results in securing the natural rights of the citizens for whom that particular branch or person of government is responsible, that is a virtuous government or a virtuous representative or a virtuous functionary of the government. And to the extent that they fail to do that, that measures their vice, measures their corruption. So
yeah, and don't you mentioned something there a minute ago about holding people accountable, selecting the right person and then holding them accountable. And I think we could always make the argument that the wrong people were selected, depending on perspective and those types of things. But holding people accountable, you would think that if you are for your state or your local government, or certainly for the federal government, and you wanted what is best for everyone as a whole, that you would want all elected officials to be held accountable, not just your party officials or whatever. So I think we've really dropped the ball on holding elected officials accountable. Like there are no consequences for their actions.
Yes, sir, I would agree. And the best example I can think of for that is when I served in the West Virginia House of Delegates. The House of Delegates impeached each member of the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. Every single justice was impeached. And they were impeached with cause. It wasn't that we just decided we didn't like them. There were specific reasons that we had investigated, and you can go back and you can do your own research because the information was made public. There were newspaper articles and news reports about this, but the intent was to hold the very people who are responsible. They are the last line of defense for the people of the state of West Virginia in defining and interpreting West Virginia law,
right,
to ensure that the government is actually virtuous. These are the people who do that. They are the last line of defense, and we had determined that they were corrupt. So we impeached them. And then, of course, according to the Constitution, what happens is the House impeaches, and then the Senate tries the impeachment. And
right.
the Senate threw up their hands and said, we're not doing it. Just your West Virginia Senate just threw their hands up and said, we're not going to try this impeachment.
We're not doing our job.
Yeah, they made a bunch of excuses, but what it finally came down to is they just said, we're not doing this. We're not doing we are not going to pursue the objective of government of the people, by the people, for the people. We're not going to uphold the principles of our republic, which state that, you know, one branch holds the other branch, the other two branches accountable, and the other two branches hold each branch accountable. We're not going to uphold all the principles upon which our government was founded. And so, in other words, the actions of our West Virginia Senate were not virtuous because they didn't attain to the standard of securing your natural rights. Now, am I saying that they should have tried the impeachments and found everybody guilty of everything I thought they were guilty of? I mean, I personally think that they should have, because there was good reason to believe they were guilty. But no, what I'm saying is they should have held a valid trial for each of the justices. And instead, they went around and pretended like the House had done things wrong and not followed protocol, which what protocol is there for impeaching your entire Supreme Court? Especially when the Constitution requires that the Chief Justice, who, by the way, was impeached, the Chief Justice preside over the trial of an impeachment. You know, so basically the West Virginia Senate just said, nah, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do our job. Which, frankly, from my perspective, means that they are all impeachable.
Right.
But of course, when I recommended that we impeach all of the senators who voted not to try the impeachments of the justices, the House leadership said, you know, there's no purpose.
You need to sit down and be quiet.
They told me that a lot. Sit down and shut up, boy. So, and I really appreciate you bringing that up, Todd. So, because we formed the union and we have established the standard based on natural law, the standard being to secure our natural rights. And because that makes us, we the people, are responsible to hold, first of all, to choose virtuous people to serve in our government. And secondly, to then hold the people we've chosen accountable to the virtue, to make them, to hold them accountable to virtuous standards. That standard being that they serve the principles for which the government was established. We can't do that if we are not virtuous.
Right.
So what normally happens in government? What normally happens is, especially in relatively free governments, and especially in compassionate societies like we have in the United States, generally speaking, Americans are very compassionate people. They don't want their neighbors to suffer. And that's honorable, and I respect that. But here's what happens as a result of that. Someone comes along and says, well, this happened with the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. You probably know this, Todd, but I think it's before 1913, Americans kept 100% of their paycheck. Now, the other thing is that Americans worked hard to take care of their neighbors. The progressives in U.S. government came along and they proposed that the U.S. government confiscate all real and durable property. So what's real and durable property? Your home, it's real property. Any land you might own, if you own a business, the building that you work out of, you know, any land, like if you're a farmer, the land that you grow your crops on. Now, durable property is the machinery or the means of transportation, whatever you got. So if you're a farmer, that would be your tractor. Right. If you a small industry, that would be, you know, whatever machines or tools. You know, if you're a mechanic, you have the machines and tools you use to do your job. If you're an individual citizen who doesn't own a business, that would include your vehicle, your car. The government would literally own it. And then they would rent it back to you so that you could then work to earn a living. But of course, in paying the rent on your own home and your own vehicle and your own business, you would only get to keep 50% or less of what the business earned. That was what they literally proposed at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, the American people said, no, we're not doing that. Well, then they came back and said, oh, but what about the poor people? What about the old people? What about the veterans and the children and, you know, all of this stuff, all of these people who are suffering? And of course, the compassionate, gracious American people said, you're right. They need to be taken care of. The question that was never asked is the government the right tool to handle that process? Is the government the right agency? Government is one thing. It's a sword. That's all it is. It is an offensive weapon. The government exists to secure your natural rights, and it does so by holding people accountable when they infringe upon your rights. Well, one of your rights is the right to dispose of your private property as you will.
Right.
Why is that a right that accrues to you naturally? Well, because you own yourself. Any private property that you own, you presumably have earned by working, or you have created. And you do that by investing the elements of yourself, your time, your effort, your capabilities, your resources. That's how you accrue private property. Oh, a car, you know, that's how you go about making this your private property. Now, lately there's been a move to change the word private to personal. So personal property is like your toothbrush. Private property is what you pay for. Personal property is what you personally, as a human being, own and use on a daily basis. And there's a good reason for that. They want to deprive you of private property and leave you with just your personal property, your toothbrush and your t-shirt and your comb.
Disposable things.
Right, exactly. But the durable items are your private property, and they are yours because you earned them by investing yourself. So in purchasing something, by earning money, by investing yourself, your time, your capabilities, your resources, all that kind of stuff, what you've actually done is invested yourself to build or create that wealth that you then use to purchase those items that become your private property. If someone confiscates those things from you, what they're literally doing is stealing your labor, and you work for them for nothing.
Right.
They are putting you into forced servitude. So,
and where else do we see that happen?
Well, the American people said, no, we don't really want to do that. You can't have my house. And so the government said, okay, well, what we'll do then is we'll allow local governments to place a lien against your house and charge you taxes for the privilege of owning what you purchased with the money that you earned by the investment of your time, effort, capability. You get what I'm saying? So you've invested yourself in earning the money to purchase a house. We now own that house, but we'll let you live there. We'll let you live there as long as you pay us a tax for the privilege of owning this private property. It's called a property tax. So you buy a house, you get a mortgage, you pay it off, you pay the insurance, you pay all this stuff. But if you choose not to pay the property tax, what happens?
They come and foreclose on your property.
They do. They actually, quote, repossess your house. How do they repossess something they never possessed in the first place?
Right.
They have laid claim to your home. Now, based on my understanding of the discussion we're having about virtue, that is not virtuous. That is
absolutely not.
That's not a virtuous process of government. So effectively, we the people must within ourselves have enough virtue to cause our government to function virtuously by first choosing virtuous people to operate as the agents of that government, whether that's as a congressional representative or a guy who works in an office downtown or at the DMV, whatever. Our job is to choose the right people and then to hold them accountable to the principles for which the government was founded. That is virtue. Now, that is virtue in governance. Now, the virtue that's required of us is, first of all, knowledge. Secondly, courage. And thirdly, focus. Right? We have to maintain our focus on our government. We can't just elect the right people and go sit down at home and expect them to do the right things. We have to call them up and say, hey, Bob, what are you doing, man? Here is your purpose. This is why you exist. This is why you hold office. It's why you have that cool title that make people look up to you, although they should view you as their messenger boy. They view you as some sort of a petty tyrant. I'm going to take that away from you. that position, that title, all that stuff you love, we're going to take that away from you because you are not behaving in a virtuous manner. Please correct your actions.
Right.
But the thing is, we have to contain the virtue, first of all, of knowledge of how the government should function and why. Secondly, courage. So courage is the natural result of recognizing that something is more important than you. All right. So I'm a combat veteran, U.S. Army infantry officer. I'm retired now, obviously, but I saw some really amazing acts of courage. And every single time somebody asked, why would you do that? Why would you put yourself in that position? The response was some version of, well, this was going to happen if I didn't. And then I was able to say, so you considered that more important than your own life? And the response was invariably, well, of course.
Right.
You know, in one particular instance, I had a guy who put himself in a lot of danger and in the process prevented another vehicle loaded with my men from, you know, being in the blast zone of an IED. I don't want to get into it too much, but, you know, and I asked him about it and he said, well, no, yeah, I mean, of course I'm going to do what I had to do to make sure that they knew not to go there because they might have died. So he viewed the lives of his buddies as valuable enough to risk his own life. That
Right.
is where that moral courage is a lot like physical courage in that it comes from the same source. So if we recognize that the virtue of government is more important than our own comfort, than our own free time, than our own, you know, wanting to appear like good people or wanting to, you know what I want? I want to be left alone, Todd. Now, anybody who's seen the engagement that I've taken or the way that I've engaged in West Virginia politics in the past 5 or 6 years would be surprised to hear that. I think that all I really want is for the government to leave me alone. But it's a fact. But I have given up on that. That's not going to happen. The government's not going to leave me alone. There are too many people who think that their job is to force us or to agitate us into behaving the way they want us to. And that is the problem. So courage comes from recognizing that holding your government accountable to the standards of virtuous government, in other words, upholding and securing the natural rights of every single citizen, that is more important than your comfort, than your time, than your desire to be left alone. It just is. Because especially if you have posterity, you have kids, grandkids, and you expect great grandkids to come along, then whatever happens to you in your own life pales by comparison to the prospects for your children and grandchildren.
Right. And don't you think it would be fair to say that, I mean, I think about these sorts of things and I think, you know, you and I are in the same age bracket. The things that were taught to us in public school at the time that we were growing up are much changed from what how they are today. And I feel that I'm not just talking about only the younger generation, but the lack of education about these subjects, whether it be virtue, uh, you know, how government works, why you should be involved in government. You don't have to be an elected official, but you should know what's going on in your local and your state government and, you know, how you can play a part in that. And like you said, you call up your elected official and say, hey, Bob, what are you doing?
Right.
You know, the ship's about to capsize and you're, you know, playing tiddlywinks.
Yep. Or even worse, you're one of the guys running over to the side that's about to go under and trying to make sure it goes under.
Right.
Listen, I don't ever want to hear anybody ever again say that we should all assume that anyone who's engaged in this process is doing what they believe is right and we all just disagree about that. Because I know for a fact from the conversations I've been in that there have been people who said, look, I know this is not what we should be doing, but we're going to do it anyway. And I'm talking about leadership, for leadership in your government.
Yep.
So, you know, I went into this under that assumption that we were all just Americans trying to live free and do the right thing, and that all of us wanted all of that for each other, and that, you know, we just all kind of understood it differently. And that is not true. And I hate to tell you that, because I tell you what, it broke my heart to discover that there were people sitting in the legislature with me who sincerely believed that it was the government's job to compel us to behave the way that they wanted us to. And
yeah, we're doing it for the greater good.
the greater good is to secure the individual natural rights of each citizen. That's it. That is the standard. And anything the government does other than that is necessarily oppressive, and it needs to stop.
Right.
So if we look through Western traditions of virtue and government, we can find some connotations for governance in a free and just society. So if we want our society to be free and just, we have to kind of understand these concepts. Socrates, when he was talking with Gorgias, demonstrated the fundamental importance of honest inquiry. Honest inquiry. Cannot tell you how many times I sat in the House of Delegates and I asked questions that not only apparently have not occurred to most people, but also were actually discouraged. You know, why are we doing this? Well, you know, Marshall, look, just just vote in favor of it. Okay, but why? What's the purpose? How does this secure the individual natural rights of any single West Virginian? And the response was always, well, look, you know, what we need to do is we need to just make it easier for the government to. No, stop. Anytime you say that you're trying to make it easier for the government to do anything, what you're really saying is you're making it harder for the people to live free. Simple, bottom line. And, you know, if you are going to make it harder for people to live freely, there needs to be a compelling reason for doing that. And the fact that you don't like their dog is not a compelling reason.
Right.
So honest inquiry has to be a part of this process. You know, people talk about how they'd like to make government more effective. Make it more effective. You know, we got all these processes that don't seem to work together, and they all seem to kind of run against each other and slow down the effectiveness of the government at doing things. And just a couple of years ago, Jim Justice, our illustrious governor of West Virginia, declared a state of emergency that did not meet any of the standards of a state of emergency, but which gave him undue powers that he should not have had. And then the legislature refused to end that state of emergency for an extended period of time, although there was no emergency, not by any of the standards that are used by the emergency operations community. None. Now, there were some hazards and some issues, and there were even some problems in certain parts of the state that needed to be dealt with, but none of that constituted a statewide emergency. And
Right.
yet this man declared an emergency, assumed powers that were not his, took power away from the people through their elected representatives in the legislature. And
Well,
then this inquiry. Go ahead.
well, that's right. He did take the power away from the people. But, you know, the sad part of that whole situation is that the elected officials of the people would not do anything to stop him, you know, would not call a session.
Their representatives just kind of folded their hands and said, well, the governor, I mean, I've literally heard this from members of the legislature. You know, the governor said we have to do this. You don't work for the governor. You work for me. Tell the governor to go jump in a lake.
That's right.
I can't really do that. I mean, he's in charge. In charge of what? He's the chief executive. Means he is the chief. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're right. The chief of the executive branch. That's what I was going to say.
The legislature worked for the governor.
Right. I remember at a time when the mask mandate was on, and I went into a restaurant and I was going to eat dinner with my parents, and they were sitting 20 feet from me. And the lady stopped me at the counter and said, "Oh, you have to have a mask on." And I said, "Well, I'm just going to that table right there. And then I'm going to take my mask off so that I can eat, you know?" And she said, "Oh, no, but it's a law." And I said, "A law?" And she said, yeah. And I said, who made that law? And she said, the governor. And I said, well, I don't know if you don't understand this or not, but the governor doesn't make law. You know, he's just the chief of the executive branch.
Right.
So I
As a
said,
matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. His job is to enforce and to enact the law. I mean, to fulfill the laws.
right,
In other words, the legislature literally tells him what to do, and it's his job to make sure that the executive branch, the branch of government that affects the laws, that executes the laws, that they actually do it. That's his only job.
right,
Now, I will say, as a caveat to that, that the owner of a private institution, a restaurant or a business or whatever, has every right in the world to tell me that I have to wear a mask to go in there.
that's
And I
right.
have the world to say, well, thank you for your time and walk away. But the government has no right to tell you that. And
Correct.
of course, the owner of a private business only has the right to tell you that you may not enter their business if you don't comply. And then you say, okay, well, I won't enter your business then. But no one has the right to tell you. The governor, least of all, has the right to tell you that you have to put a mask on your face.
Correct.
Someone might advise you that it's a good idea, and you might decide, hey, they make a lot of sense. But that's the whole point. They have to make the argument to you. And that's the way things work in a virtuous government. Aristotle wrote an entire treatise on ethics, and it's pretty fascinating. He talks a lot about moral and intellectual virtue as well as continence. And continence there is not specific to physical continence. It's continence of character, being able to control yourself. So he talks about how the basis of everything is moral character. And again, I don't want to get mixed up here with what we consider morality in postmodern America, which is a set of rules established by a certain denomination or sect or religion. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a greater breadth of morality that is applicable to all men. And what is the basis for that morality? Natural law. Whether you believe, whether you are agnostic, atheist, Roman Catholic, Buddhist, crazy backwoods Southern Baptist like me, that's not the relevant point. The point is that there is a law which governs the interaction of men that is beyond the ability of men to affect. There is a standard natural law that is beyond the laws made by men, beyond constitutions, beyond the interactions of men. And no man, I don't care if he's an emperor or a philosopher or a multi-bazillionaire, can change those. There is no way to change those. They are immutable and eternal, right? Or not eternal, but will last as long as nature does anyway. And the thing is that is the basis for morality and also ethics. That is the starting point. And the starting point is from natural law distilled into these two points. All men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. These are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The other side of that is all men are corrupt. That's the only reason we need a government. And that's the only purpose for the government, is to secure those natural rights. So the simple fact is that on occasion, out of my corruption, out of my weakness, out of my selfishness, I will do something that treads on someone else's natural rights. The one thing, Todd, that is most usually comes up in conversations with my wife and other people who care about where I tread on other people's rights is when other people are talking, I just talk right over them. And I'm laughing not because it's funny, but because I'm embarrassed that I do that. I don't have a right to do that, and I need to be held accountable for it. And it's only in being held accountable for it that I become a better man. I come more into line with what's ethically and morally acceptable.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, you've never talked over me that I recall, but
that's because you're just maybe a little dishonest. I don't know.
no, I was just making you laugh. But you know, it's just like if I say a Spanish word and I pronounce it incorrectly, you correct me, and I appreciate you for that. A lot of people might be offended, but you hold me accountable. You teach me that I've said something wrong or that I have an incorrect fact, and to me, that's part of what friendship is about because you're seeking to make me better. And you know, I mean, if you were showboating or something like that, that would be different. But I think that that's part of friendship or any relationship, really, is that you should be able to have an open dialogue and say, "Hey, you know, why do you think this?" Or perhaps you said this wrong, or use this word in the wrong context, or you know, whatever the case may be. I think
And
that that's part of love.
I agree. And as long as the intent is right, and as long as we both recognize each other's rights and authorities. In other words, I don't have the right to punch you in the mouth because you mispronounced a word in Spanish. I only have the right to say, hey, Todd, I believe it's actually pronounced this way. And then you can do with that information whatever you want. So that brings us right into Locke's second treatise of politics. What we're talking about is how we govern our relationship, you and I, right?
Right.
We do it out of mutual respect, and we also do it out of recognition that neither of us is perfect. Each of us recognizes that neither of us is perfect. So that brings us into Locke's second treatise of politics, which advocates the idea that the virtue of civil society is in the context of employing the force of community for the common good. The force of community. So the force of community can take various forms. You can be shunned from a community. That's, you know, they say we don't want to deal with you. We don't want to put up with you. You know, I agitated people in high school and ended up sitting by myself for lunch. I got shunned. You know,
Sure.
and
Or you know, that's very common in the Amish community for sure.
right, and I learned from that. That helped me to correct my behavior. And once again, the common good is the security of each individual person's natural rights. I know we're getting short of time here. So basically what we determined is that everything is founded on the principles that all men are created equal with a certain set of rights that we all have. We all have the same set of rights, and all men are corrupt. So we tend to infringe upon each other's rights. We have a government that's there to protect the rights of each one of us, right? Now, the problem is if the government doesn't function according to those principles, then it's not going to do its job and is in fact going to become a repository of power used by the people who work in the government to actually deprive the rest of us of our natural rights. And I think that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode is how the government actually goes against its purpose and instead of securing our natural rights, deprives of our natural rights or infringes upon our natural rights and becomes literally oppressive. So if we can, maybe that's what we'll talk about next time.
Sure.
All right.
Well, that sounds good. And thank you for your insight. And this has been a good episode, and we will continue along with the next one. Once again, I would like to thank all of our listeners and viewers for your support. And we couldn't do it without you. We're very gracious to have you on board. And do you have any closing statements there, Marshall?
I just thank you all for putting up with me, and I hope that the things we talk about are helpful. And I'm grateful that you're here. Please come back and please let your friends know about us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.
Reach